So Jesus just got done feeding 5,000 people, one of the most famous miracles he ever performed. And people were on board with this. They were loving it. They were eating it up. Pun intended. So Jesus is building this huge following. In today's parlance, we would say he's going viral. But then, at the height of his popularity, he says something kind of weird. He says, "Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you will not have eternal life." At which point, Jesus loses a lot of people. And this raises a lot of questions. Questions like, if Jesus' goal was to get as many followers as possible, why did he say something so inflammatory? What did he even mean by that? Surely he wasn't being literal. And what does the Bible have to say? Let's take a look.
Attention, bargain shoppers.
So eating his flesh and drinking his blood. This is something that, if taken literally, would go well and beyond anything that would have been considered acceptable in that time. If we look at Leviticus 17:12, we're told, "You must never eat or drink blood, neither you nor the foreigners living among you." So let's give a little bit of context here. Jesus feeds 5,000 people. This is a big deal back then. For us today, it would have been a big deal. But back then, food supply was not a stable thing. They didn't have refrigeration. They didn't have global shipping. They didn't have supermarkets. If a harvest failed, then famine followed. If there was a drought, people died. If there was a war, entire communities may starve. So you have this society where whoever holds the food holds the power. Rulers taxed grain. Armies, when they would invade a city, one of the first things they do was secure the store of foods. But what others taxed, Jesus gave away at no cost. So naturally, tons of people are going to start following him. They want what he had, what he was giving away. And Jesus recognizes this. That's why he says in John 6:26, "Very truly I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill." So this is the background. Jesus has been performing miracles and providing food for people. And then Jesus turns the conversation from the physical into the spiritual. In verse 35, Jesus declares, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." So Jesus is saying, I am the bread. And there's a lot of significance in this that the people listening to Jesus would have understood, but it might be lost on those of us reading this today. For example, ancient Jews would have been very familiar with the story of Moses and how the Israelites were starving in the desert and God sustained them by sending manna from heaven. And Jesus draws this comparison. For even back in the Old Testament, God was teaching the same thing, that people cannot live on just bread alone. Deuteronomy 8:3 says, "He humbled you, causing you to hunger and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." So we have this message from God that is unchanging in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. That we have physical needs that we need to nurture and we need to support. And we also have spiritual needs that we need to nourish and sustain in a very similar way. So when Jesus says, "I tell you the truth, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you cannot have eternal life," he is being metaphorical in a way. It is true that he's not advocating for people to literally eat pieces of his body and drink his blood. However, interesting thing about this story, Jesus does not make that distinction at the time. If this was a message being given in churches today, the pastor would definitely be like, "All right, everybody, listen, I'm not being serious. Just to be clear, this is a teaching point. I don't want you to drink blood for real." But Jesus did not do that. He chose his words, he said what he said, and then he just left it at that. Well, thousands of potential followers and even some of his close disciples either questioned him or turned away from him. Now, it's not explicitly stated, but it's sort of implied that this was the point that Judas decided to betray Jesus. John 6:64 through 65 says, "For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. He went on to say, 'This is why I told you that that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled him. So this was an interesting moment for Jesus. He sort of does the opposite of what you'd expect somebody to do in that position. He's growing in popularity, he's gaining followers, and then he says something that seems almost intentionally designed to alienate all but the most ardent of supporters. And Jesus does this to demonstrate that salvation cannot be obtained from afar. He wasn't looking for passive supporters. He wasn't looking for people that were just there for the show. He wanted people that were totally on board with him. I mean, the imagery of eating someone's flesh and drinking their blood is a very intimate act, very personal. And this is something that the ancient Israelites would have understood. If we look at Leviticus 17:11, "For the life of a creature is in its blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life." And so here we also have an allusion to Jesus' coming sacrifice, the literal spilling of his blood on the cross for us. So these words of Jesus are interesting for a number of reasons. Primarily, it was a teaching illustration to show us that we need to hunger and thirst for faith, just as we hunger and thirst for nourishment for our bodies. But Jesus chose to frame it in a pretty harsh way, in a way that if you're not willing to really dive in and explore the meaning of Jesus' words, you will likely just be offended and walk away. So at the end of the day, Jesus was being inflammatory on purpose. Inflammatory doesn't mean wrong. This was a teaching from God. But through it, he invites people to carefully consider their choices and not just go along with the crowd when following him. But if you have a different interpretation, I'd love to hear it. Go ahead and leave a comment below. Also, feel free to like and subscribe. That does help out the channel. I'll leave the verses used today down in the description. My name is Adam. This is Bargain Bin Theology. And remember, you get what you pay for.